So this title, by the way, was from Olaf, so he gets all the credit or the blame or whatever. I promise you that I would have chosen a shorter title, but maybe you guys would have liked that title even less. So maybe this is for the best. And exactly, scroll off the page. Now, please make this interactive. I'm planning to speak for maybe 40 minutes, so we'll have hopefully 20 minutes for questions. But in the meantime, we can also take questions or comments, in the middle. So don't hesitate, especially if you hear me saying anything that you disagree with. Today, I'm going to try to stick to just the facts in the morning session, and then participating in the closing thing about the future. Maybe even get more opinionated. But maybe you'll see a few opinions scattered in here, although not intentionally. So first, I'm gonna riff on the theme from yesterday morning and give you guys HTML5 in 7 minutes, and then EPUB in 7 minutes, more or less. I won't time these exactly, and then finish with a comparison of the capabilities of these ecosystems. So first, just a word about the organization I'm part of currently, the International Digital Publishing Forum, or the IDPF. We're a nonprofit trade and standards organization. You might say similar to the W3C, maybe similar to the PDF Association. That is about 300 organizational members, now from over 35 different countries. And the mission of the organization is to develop and promote the EPUB standard as the universal global accessible format for digital publications. Of course, we realize that there's some overlap perhaps in this mission statement, so we'll get into that. But what I think is unique about what we're doing is the focus on unifying digital publishing and open web standards. So we operate in close liaison with the W3C and focusing on the needs of the publishing industry rather than doing de novo standards development of new things. So that's enough about the organization. Let's get back to our 7 minutes on HTML5. So probably everyone here has an idea about HTML5, but I'm going to try to just make sure to set a baseline on that technically so that we can continue the discussion about the application in publications. So HTML5 is a markup language. It's XML origins, XML-ish, or I should say there's an XML serialization of it, as well as a what's called tag soup or a street HTML version. And HTML extends the previous version of HTML with a number of new elements for different purposes, for navigational markup, for multimedia and interactivity, including especially things like video, and a number of new input types for forms and various miscellaneous things. So at a certain level, you can say that's HTML5, the new elements and associated attributes and other schema points added to the HTML language. But that's not what most of us mean when we say HTML5. In fact, it's not even what the W3C means when they, for that logo, HTML5. Really, HTML5 is more, in a more marketing sense or in a broader sense, referring to a constellation of technologies. So when people say HTML5, and when I'm saying it here for this presentation, they're really referring to websites that are, leading edge websites designed to work on modern web browsers that include a number of things. They might have embedded audio or video without needing any plugins. They might have native interactivity, animation, or game type content, again, without needing any plugins. Things like geolocation functionality or other APIs that enable JavaScript to access the system in an interesting way, accelerometer APIs and so forth. Sites that have local storage so that content can be downloaded and saved. And then a whole host of things added to the cascading style sheets, the CSS language. There's a set of CSS3 modules that are largely associated with HTML5, although from a specification point of view, they have absolutely nothing to do with HTML5, which doesn't normatively reference CSS specs or vice versa. But that includes, as simple as multi-column support, text shadows, and all the way up to more complicated CSS transformations and animations. Then there's also a native support for a couple of new vocabularies in modern browsers, including MathML and SVG, scalable vector graphics that probably most all of you in this room have some familiarity with, They are normatively referenced from the HTML5 spec, but only very briefly, and are really separate standalone specs. But they are now implemented, SVG anyway, in every modern browser that's shipping, and MathML has at least partial implementation in several browsers. And then lastly, there is a lot of semantic markup in HTML itself. So those elements that I showed you before, sorry, I'm going backwards. Hold on here, gotta go back up. These elements here, the semantic ones here on the left under navigation, that's changing how HTML markup can be handled from a semantic inflection point of view. But that's when people say HTML5, that's the only piece of this that's actually part of HTML5. Everything else here is really about JavaScript, about CSS, around related technologies like SVG. So it's really about the modern browser. And so when people say HTML5 browser, they're not talking about the markup language. They're talking about this constellation of technologies. So I won't show you demos because we have limited time today, but you can see, of course, many demos of all this rich interactivity on the web. Certainly, Adobe was a motivation in working towards HTML5, and you might say in the negative sense, because the web community decided that depending on a proprietary plugin for rich media and interactivity in the web wasn't the right way to go, and that something was needed that made that part of the open web standards. So essentially, you can see a lot of these demos are things that you could say, well, we could have used Flash for that, and that's absolutely the case, and that's no accident. In fact, the focus of HTML5 was, quote, web applications, or what Adobe and others have been calling RIAs, rich internet applications, for many years. For more information, there's a nice book from O'Reilly called HTML5 for Publishers that focuses on thinking about HTML5 not just from an application point of view, but for its relevancy to publishing. There's a variety of books out there in the market from various folks, including but not limited to O'Reilly, around various aspects of HTML5. Just things like the Canvas API, a direct drawing API alone, we could spend the whole hour working, talking about that. So we're not going to. So that's my 7 minutes, 6 minutes and 57 seconds on HTML5. And now we're going to move on for EPUB, which I probably can't talk about in 7 minutes, but we'll give it a try. So EPUB is designed to enable publishers to create and deliver a single file to multiple digital distribution channels. Actually, this shows that I wasn't thinking clearly because for this audience, of course, PDF serves that purpose too, although it's typically the file sent for print distribution purposes or where a replica of paper is what's important. EPUB is designed initially for the ebook community to enable files that are distributed that aren't bound to a final form representation. Because the point of EPUB is content that can adapt to different devices as appropriate. So if you want to read it on this, or a 6-inch e-ink screen, or a 10-inch tablet, or a 7-inch tablet, the content can appropriately adapt to the context of the device. And as I mentioned before, it's about the convergence of digital publishing with the web/browser platform. The format has been around quite a long time. It originated back in 2000 when there was you might say, a first bloom of work on ebooks. And the content has always been based on web technology. So the original version was a subset of XHTML and CSS, sort of a special profiles of both of those formats. But there was no packaging associated with it. It was just initially an interchange format for certain publishers to be able to send content to certain distribution channels that would accept it and then convert it to some distribution-oriented format. In 2007, the whole ecosystem really took a major leap forward with the introduction of a packaging for EPUB. And actually, Adobe led a lot of the work on this and had kind of re-engaged with ebooks and this organization at that time, and had decided that clearly PDF wasn't going to be as appropriate where you needed content that adapted to the device, and that promoting and advancing this open standard was the way to go for that. And so some of this innovation that led to EPUB 2 happened courtesy of Adobe. You might say in a little side business from some of the other stuff going on then. And it's been broadly adopted as the interchange and delivery format for ebooks We have support now from Apple. Their iBooks platform is selling .EPUB files. Google eBooks, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Sony. And Amazon is known widely for having a proprietary ebook format called MobiPocket. However, all of the big publishers in the United States and UK and other places are sending their files to Amazon in EPUB format, and Amazon is responsible for converting it to theirs. Smaller publishers, Amazon makes them do the conversion, but essentially either way, the workflow in almost every case starts with EPUB and gets converted to Amazon's format. So Amazon, you might say, is using EPUB in its original use case of an interchange format from the publisher to the distributor, not as a delivery format out to the end user, because Amazon, for a variety of reasons, wants to have that delivery format tied to them. And we've succeeded in some sense with this create once, distribute everywhere, in that folks like Harlequin and Random House in the US that have relatively simple trade books, novels and linear nonfiction, are able to send one EPUB file, the same file, to dozens, in some cases, of distribution channels without any changes. So there is a significant ecosystem now that has achieved that goal. There are certain cases where someone might make a different EPUB file for one channel versus another, just like the same PDF might not be sent to every place. But generally speaking, this vision of a supply chain that can have a single distribution format has been achieved for the original class of content for which EPUB was designed. So I'm going to move right on. I guess that was my, let's see how many minutes I did on, that was less than 7 minutes on EPUB in its previous form, and now I'll talk about EPUB 3, the new standard, which was designed to expand the applicability of the content for highly designed and interactive content. Also to achieve alignment with the modern web standards, collectively known as HTML5, and with two very specific objectives around accessibility support, which was always a part of the EPUB world, but to really sort of double down on the support there, and global language support, particularly Asian and other non-Latin oriented languages. So EPUB is designed to let content reflow. So the vision of EPUB is that content can adapt to the size of display it needs to, not be fixed. So if you have a PDF in 3 columns, and if you make your screen smaller, your choices are to pan and zoom around or shrink by zooming to where it might be unreadable. And in the case of EPUB, the general behavior is to dynamically repaginate the content. So EPUB is designed for you might say, instead of being typeset at the factory, the way PDF is, EPUB is typeset on the fly at the point where it's consumed. But now with EPUB 3, and even before EPUB 3, thanks to work by Apple in sort of adding on some of the features we were adding to EPUB 3 into their iBooks platform about a year ago, we have fixed layout content being distributed in EPUB. And the screenshots I'm going to show you are all from the shipping iBook 2.0 platform from Apple, commercial content that's available on the iBook store. And there's many thousands now of fixed layout files there. And this is an example of just something that was probably laid out for print purposes. It really wasn't designed or specifically for the iPad screen, because the aspect ratio and everything else is not right, but it was economic for the publisher to make an EPUB and distribute it that way rather than reauthoring it into another format. For things like children's books, you might have stuff there that really isn't reasonable to reflow. It's a work of art where every page, the text and the image are tied together in a very specific way. Of course, that's also true of things like magazines, where you have things like two-page spreads or other complex page designs that really aren't designed to reflow. And even content that theoretically could reflow like this might have a very complicated layout of the information in different boxes, different ways that information is expressed visually that make the fixed layout representation a more faithful representation of what the publisher intended and a more compelling experience for the reader than trying to reflow it. So now all of these things can be done in EPUB as well as PDF. But some people might ask, well, what's the point? I mean, we've already got PDF. Why don't you use PDF for those purposes, not EPUB? And in fact, some of us even involved in EPUB asked that question when we started seeing this Apple accepting fixed layout EPUB, but not accepting a PDF for commercial sale in their iBook store. we realized that there are some big advantages that PDF brought to the table that made that not as crazy or capricious as it might have seemed. One could be seen here, which is this particular content. This is a screenshot, but it has embedded video, embedded audio, it has a pop-up, it has interactivity that was able to be implemented by Hachette Livre, the publisher here, is one of the top publishers worldwide, using standard web technologies and standard web tools, not using anything proprietary. I don't think there's been any discussion so far in this program about interactive PDF, and that's mainly because interactive PDF really hasn't been, let's say, very active. One reason for that is that it's rather challenging to get use something that, first of all, may not work or does not work on most PDF reading systems that don't come from a vendor named Adobe, and secondly, that requires specialized skills, use of specialized scripting language, specialized APIs, etc. So this kind of content, this fixed layout content, could be thought of as similar than PDF, but having the power that you can add onto it with standard web technologies. There's a few other things I'll talk about this later when we get to comparing and contrasting, but let's just say it wasn't just an accident of Apple leading to this fixed layout, but in fact some broader applicability. So what's inside an EPUB? It's basically a zip file that has assets in it. I won't go through these assets here. I will note just in passing that there is signature and encryption information. The rudiments of things like digital signature support is there. That was intentionally not fully fleshed out in our specs, and so we in fact don't have any of the digital signature sort of end-to-end or digital rights management end-to-end solution standardized in EPUB right now, but instead have relied on vendors to build on the basic building blocks and add their own proprietary solutions on top. But essentially, the content in an EPUB file is made up of these items: the XHTML, the markup, the SVG, the CSS, potentially JavaScript in the case of interactivity, MathML potentially, media, and fonts. Now, the interesting thing is, with the exception of this obfuscation, where we implemented an obfuscation algorithm in order to have fonts be embeddable and have the similar level of difficulty of extracting them as exists with the PDF, which is that it can be done, but it can't be done by a naive user just by dragging a font, which otherwise would have been the case with a .otf inside a zip file. With the exception of this obfuscation, everything else here is just what you would call HTML5. Again, using it in that broader term, referring to a constellation of technologies. So you might say, well, if the content is just all this HTML5 stuff, then isn't an EPUB just HTML5 in a zip file? I mean, what's the big deal here? And to a certain level, that's true, but you might say that EPUB 3 is HTML5 domesticated. In the wild, HTML5 is not something that you can do a lot with the way you can with the PDF. You can't insert and extract pages or chunks of content in a reliable way, for example, from an HTML5 website. In fact, the even concept of a website isn't even a well-defined notion in the web world. EPUB content is HTML5 content that's structured, that's navigable. It means it has a beginning and a middle and end. There's an ordering of top-level resources. There's also a table of contents that's machine readable. It's packaged. That's the zip file part. It's all XML-based, so EPUB requires the XML serialization of HTML5, XHTML5, which means that it can be created and manipulated reliably with all the XML tools people use, XSLT, etc. It is, as a result, much easier to make it accessible. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And it's interoperable, and that's really the key point. If I give somebody an arbitrary website that I've packaged up into a zip file, the chances that it is going to be interoperable for somebody else to take in and do something with is very low, much less that it can be sliced and diced. That's because HTML5, as we talked about before, is optimized for web applications. I think it's incredibly cool that you can have Angry Birds written entirely in HTML5. No plugins, nothing but the browser, so to speak, and you can play it. So you can try this yourself. But you could also look at the code, because it's HTML5, you can view source. And if you tried to make sense out of that code, if you tried to say, let's take a piece of it and pull it out and reuse it, it wouldn't be possible. It's a monolithic application. It's spaghetti. So what EPUB does is take arbitrary HTML5 and make it structured, reliable, navigable, accessible, interoperable, etc. It makes an HTML5 website or web application into a, you might say, lowercase p portable document. And of course, the reason for that is from a publishing point of view, you need scale. You're not handcrafting apps one at a time or websites one at a time, but rather you need to have replicable, scalable business processes. So I'm not going to go into all the detail around the structure of EPUB. There's a variety of things that give it the properties I mentioned that include the manifest, the spine, the navigation document. We do have features like media overlays that enable synchronizing pre-recorded audio with text. We have things called canonical fragment identifiers that enable fine-grained referencing, so that you can have the equivalent of PDF annotations that refer to an arbitrary text selection that wouldn't be easy to do in normal HTML5, and ways to take the JavaScript that is there and make that JavaScript more modular. So you could, for example, we build in support for MathML in EPUB 3, but there's a million other markup languages out there and other formats like PRC, the 3D format. It is possible in EPUB to extend an individual document with a JavaScript handler for a new media type, ChemML or even something like PRC, and have that be packaged. But if the reading system knows how to handle that content type, it can ignore that, and the JavaScript isn't intermingled with the content the way it would be normally. You could maybe go so far as to say that a normal website with JavaScript is kind of like PostScript. All you can really do is execute it and see what happens. There's no page independence, there's no ordering. In that sense, EPUB is more like EPUB to a normal website or web app is more like PDF as to PostScript. It eliminates it being an opaque programmatic representation that just has to be executed in a VM, but makes it declarative content that can be arbitrarily manipulated. We have a lot of metadata. I won't go into details on this, except to say that there is XMP in there. So we could have been listed in one of those as one of those adopting organizations there. We have intrinsic metadata and as well component level metadata and content level metadata, including an ability to do fine-grained semantic inflection at the element level, so that arbitrary HTML5 is semantically rich compared to earlier versions of HTML, but it doesn't necessarily map to a higher level schema that somebody might be using, but that those schema could be propagated down into the content itself with the element level attribution through EPUB type attribute. That's really the only, in fact, that's the only extension we've made to HTML5. We normatively reference the HTML5 spec, a number of CSS3 modules, the SVG spec, and that's a key point that EPUB 2 was sort of a subset profile of some W3C specs like XHTML 1.1 and CSS2. EPUB 3 simply normatively references those specs, which means we support the entire HTML5 ecosystem from a spec point of view and are much more tightly aligned, therefore, with the W3C. That has pluses and minuses, but it means really it is, you could think of EPUB 3 as a portable document packaging of HTML5 in a way that you couldn't have said that about EPUB 2 at any version of HTML stuff. So accessibility. We have a number of features of accessibility in EPUB 3. There's semantic markup at the element level through HTML5 and semantic inflection that I mentioned. We have a fallback framework that allows for alternate versions of content beyond the alternate means like the alt tag on an image. There's a richer, robust level of saying that if you could have multiple representations of a resource, so you might have an SVG version of a form, of a table, say, and you might also have a text or markup version of that table that could be used for text-to-speech support. I mentioned media overlays, the synchronization of pre-recorded media with the text, and then a whole host of things to make text-to-speech better. We have phonemes that can be embedded in the content using a standard called SSML. So if you have the letters DOS in your content, if it's a Spanish book, you probably should pronounce that dos. If it's a tech book, probably an older one, you should probably pronounce that DOS. But how does the text-to-speech engine know? Embedding the phoneme hint is one way. A specialized lexicon that can be embedded using another standard called PLS is a second way. We also have styles, oral styles, rate, pitch, stress, so that you can give hints to the reading system about if there's just as bold or emphasis gives hints about visual presentation, these things like rate and pitch give hints about the verbal text-to-speech. So for Dove and I, the rate goes up, for example. So The key thing about accessibility is not any of the technical things, it's the adoption that's happening. And the DAISY Consortium is a group that has been for a number of years developing specialized formats for the accessibility community for representing digital books, for learning materials and other kinds of books. And they have ceased development on their specialized standard called DTB, or Digital Talking Book, and the entire energy of the accessibility community that has been focused in this XML arena has moved to EPUB 3. And so EPUB 3 is a superset of the features that were in prior DAISY standards, and so all of the work on DAISY is moving to EPUB 3. And in fact, my CTO is jointly appointed the CTO of the DAISY Consortium and has been seconded to be also CTO of IDPF. And our board of directors president is the Secretary General of the DAISY Consortium, George Kirscher, who's blind. So having a blind board chairman, let's just say accessibility is a key part of my and all of our job. And it also means that the accessibility mandates for EPUB 3 are going to be happening pretty fast. DAISY's previous format was the basis of something called NIMAS, the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard. And so the NIMAS and its associated mandates in learning materials in the United States will be moving soon it's expected to be moving soon to EPUB 3 as its basis. And there's similar discussions going on with the European Union, where the European Union Publications Office is already creating content in EPUB, the Japanese government, the Thai government, the French government, the Taiwanese government, etc. So there's a big impetus around that, around the accessibility support here, which is rich and robust. And the vision is to enable every digital publication to be a fully accessible digital publication. As we all know, there's a lot of possible ways that might not get done in practice, depending on the representation of the content in there. But at least EPUB provides the basis for that structured representation wherever that's possible. So for more information on EPUB, there's 2 free short books. They're not books per se. You might call them more like white papers from O'Reilly at these URLs. You can grab my presentation and click through there. And I highly recommend looking at both of them. And again, they're free, so you don't have to pay anything. And then there are some tools from the IDPF that you might be interested in looking at if you want to check into this more. There's a validator, and so because it is an XML-based format, the basic framework of validation for both the content, the HTML5 and SVG content, and for the schemas that represent the packaging, the manifest, and the spine, and the navigation document, and so forth, is well defined with RelaxNG schemas that are normatively part of our specs, and so forth. So you can look at the validator.idpf.org and see the official version of that for both EPUB 2 and EPUB 3. Bless you. We have a samples project, and I think I can show you guys that here. We're gonna give this a try and see what happened here. No, that's not it. Here we go. It's like, you guys see that? Very good. Okay, so this is a list of samples in this of various EPUB 3 things. Because EPUB 3 is very new, I should mention, we just finished the standard at the end of October, and so we're just kind of rolling out the support for it now. But there's an open source project here at 9 for that. We have as well a new initiative, an open source initiative, to create an open source reference system for EPUB publications based on WebKit. Turns out that WebKit is the commonly used engine for most web browsers that are built for mobile devices, and it's also the shared engine of Apple Safari and Google Chrome. It's the engine used for Apple iBooks, which already supports most of EPUB 3 now in the shipping product. And it turned out that every vendor known to man who was going to build EPUB 3 support was going to be using WebKit, and so it made sense to try to collaborate to make that happen. And so we announced, it's still March, right? Yeah. So we announced last month. Wow, it seems like it's been a long month. We announced last month this Medium project, and you can see that there's a lot of supporters here. Adobe is one. Many people in Japan due to the importance there, but also other vendors like Barnes and Noble, Kobo, Samsung, and others. Sony, who are, in theory anyway, all collaborating together to bring a higher level of EPUB support based on it all being in WebKit. And there's a Google Chrome prototype that's available now that you can install here with this +1 add to Chrome. It will shortly be running on other browsers as a web-based application, but right now it requires it requires the Chrome browser. And I won't really do a full-on demo, but this is the EPUB. This is the Redium app, and this is showing it in action. It has various little features here, but you can see that if you make the content smaller, it doesn't pan and zoom like a PDF does, but it just reflows. So this is a reflowable EPUB. The Redium prototype also supports the fixed layout EPUB as well. So both are possible, and if you want to play with it, you can not only check this out, but you're welcome to contribute to it, contribute fixes to it, etc. So we're very happy with that part of it, and I think I'll now switch back to my presentation if I can. Yeah. Whoa. Huh? 9. What do we got here? From the beginning. Wait.
From the left, second button.
This one? From where we are? All right. Yeah, thank you. So we've talked about the samples and the Redium project. So we are continuing to push forward on the capabilities. We have 2 specs now, one that's been just standardized. We actually have the representational aspects of fixed layout in EPUB 3, and but we didn't finalize all the metadata for things like how to express something's a 2-page spread and expressing the viewing region and so forth, and basically the hints to the reading system about how to handle the fixed layout metadata. So that was, I guess I will have to go back to hit that, and this fixed layout documents was just standardized earlier this month. You can see that it included Adobe, Sony, Barnes & Noble, Google, Apple, and others collaborating together on that. So that's work that's now finished, but that's really just the metadata properties for the fixed layout. Not much to it. Just some simple property definitions using some extensibility that's already in EPUB 3. We have a much meatier template spec that's under development called CSS page templates. That's something that adds a whole pagination master page model with dynamic adjustable sort of springs and struts, you might say, parameterized template-based model. I'll mention that a little bit later, but that's also work going on in the IDPF right now. And we've got work starting up on dictionaries and indexes as well. Okay, so last part of my presentation. I definitely went over my 7 minutes there. But I've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to give you guys 20 minutes for Q&A, and I think I can do this in 10 minutes, which is the comparison of PDF to the HTML5/EPUB ecosystem. So first, I'm going to make a slight detour to something that you guys may be familiar with called Mars. How many people remember this project? All right, so yeah, most of us have been doing this stuff for a while. So Adobe previewed back in 2006 a project to develop an XML serialization of PDF. There was Acrobat and Reader import and export, experimental plugins on Adobe Labs, page contents were SVG. The packaging actually, if you looked at it, is exactly the same spec as the EPUB 2 open container format, the zip packaging of EPUB 2. And in fact, the Mars project normatively references and incorporates the IDPF documentation for EPUB 2 OCF. So it did. Let's just say there was some parallel development going on at that time. However, the Mars project didn't go anywhere. It got stopped in 2009. What happened? What did we learn? Well, one thing we learned is that just taking PDF and making an XML serialization really didn't do anything that the development community of PDF really needed. It essentially gave an XML-friendly version of the same stuff, the same features. It was still Acrobat and Reader being the engine, and the format was still, from an info set point of view, you might say, exactly the same format as the binary form. There was a fair bit of acrobatics, you might say, in the mapping of PDF page contents to SVG, but it ultimately achieved basically a lossless mapping, and so you really just had an XML version of PDF that was more friendly to tools like XSLT, but didn't give you any new workflows you could do with PDF or otherwise. So it really just wasn't a big deal. Now there's probably another reason that it didn't move forward, which is it was largely done as a response to Microsoft doing an XML-based format called XPS associated with Windows Vista, and for a variety of reasons, you might blame the it being anchored to the boat anchor of Vista. You might blame that Adobe successfully did the de jure standardization of PDF in the meantime. You might just say PDF had too much momentum and it was destined to fail. But for whatever reason, the perceived threat of XPF receded pretty rapidly. And as such, undergoing the disruption that would have happened if an alternate serialization XML had been added to the PDF ecosystem just didn't make a lot of sense. And there was never really a plan to transition. Microsoft, you might say, Microsoft went cold turkey. They went from .dot to .docx, making the XML version the serialization in the new version of Word. But the PDF ecosystem there were too many third parties out there with binary PDF tools. It would have been an incredible disruption to actually deprecate the binary version. So Mars didn't happen. But we learned a third thing from there that now is, I won't say coming back to haunt us or coming back to help us. We learned that PDF page contents can be losslessly represented as SVG. There's an asterisk on there, which is there are some extensions that had to be made to SVG, but they were mainly to handle unusual cases of Adobe transparency, unusual cases of spot color and things like that, and unusual cases of things like smooth shading. And they were all handled during the course of this project. Now, since at the time Adobe was trying to, you might say, ease SVG out of existence, that didn't really matter much then. But SVG has had an amazing recovery from its near-death experience. And in fact, it's now natively supported in every browser. When Adobe discontinued the SVG Viewer plugin, I think the expectation was, great, we're done with SVG. But in fact, there was enough use cases for it that the browser vendors took the bait, you might say, and implemented it. And now in Microsoft Explorer, Internet Explorer 9, Internet Explorer 10, and in the beta version of Google Chrome that's going to be coming out shortly, SVG is not only implemented as it is on Apple Safari and Opera, and in Safari it's there in mobile Safari for iOS, it's there in Safari for iPhone and iPad, but in the case of shipping Internet Explorer 9, and in the case of the soon-to-be shipping Google Chrome, it's hardware accelerated. Hardware accelerated SVG makes a dramatic change in what will be able to be done here. And again, we've got a format here that can losslessly represent a PDF page.
So Bill,
yes.
So just two comments on that.
Yes, please.
So one is just... Well,
I'm getting lonely up here, so thank you, Larry.
On the browser side, it should be pointed out that even though the browsers have adopted SVG, not all of them are adopting 100% of the specs. So for example, IE does not do some of the animation capabilities of SVG. Some of the browsers do not adopt the SVG fonts. But as a general statement, I agree with you, but not everyone is taking 100% of the specs. Just to put that
well, but we should also mention that the SVG adopted for PDF page contents is Adobe's own subset, which doesn't include things like animations either. So I don't know that anyone's done the mapping here, but let's just say SVG is fundamentally an XML expression of PDF page contents. I mean, it was written by somebody, Richard Cohn, who had the PDF spec open on his desk while he was typing the SVG proposal from Adobe. I mean, literally, I can vouch for that. And I mean, I was standing over him. I was his manager. And of course, that's the PostScript imaging model. So things like current transformation metrics, et cetera, are all there. When it gets to the edge cases and the fine points, there are definitely some issues.
So the other piece.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So the other piece was actually, while you're right that most of the page content model, and you point out that there are extensions, what you don't address is that the resources that connect to that page content actually did not map at all into the SVG imaging model. So for example, yesterday we talked about compression imaging formats like JPEG2 and JPEG 2000, which are not part of the HTML5 world, imaging world. So those had to be addressed. Some of the font technologies that are used in PDF don't have equivalent representation of the HTML5 world. So while the SVG language didn't have to change because it simply said use font foo, the binary representation of font foo had to be done in a way that was not compatible with the HTML5 model.
Correct.
So there's a whole lot of extra bits in PDF that cannot be losslessly transcoded.
Right. And so then one might add, that's a great intro, because lead in to say, one might add, are those extra bits, let's say non-Unicode encoded fonts, things we should dump? Okay. So, all right, but let's move on. In fact, we're about to get there. Actually, we're going to get to that point. So this is the example that was shown yesterday morning by Dov. Thank you. So you guys remember this, right? Now, I'm not going to show you the SVG version because I didn't have time to do it last night. And let's just say after the Kirsch and the wine, I wasn't ready to do it. But it's going to look almost the same. I mean, there's a TF operator and a TJ operator and the transformation matrix stuff. So, you know, I leave that as an exercise for you guys who can do it probably better than me. But let's just say the SVG version of this would be pretty much the same thing. But that's not the way most fixed layout is done in EPUB now, like the stuff that I showed you before on the iBook store. Some of it is SVG, converted directly from PDF in most cases, but some of it's coming straight from things like InDesign. And the standard there is to use something called CSS absolute positioning. Now this is a very crude way to do stuff because you're going to have a lot more variation between browsers, but you can see the same thing, and this is real. I mean, this code generates this. I mean, I didn't generate this image from it. I stole that from the presentation, but I tested this last night, and yeah, this markup on a modern browser will generate something that looks roughly like that. And you notice that you have spans here. So you've got something here that is giving you the visual appearance that's pretty much the same. And if you had an underlying image and you're trying to overlay this text on an image, which a lot of these fixed layout EPUBs in the iBook store do, it would look roughly right. But it's a lot more accessible than this because now you have the text in reading order in larger chunks. And you've got a little bit more semantic markup here. So that is today's way by preference to do fixed layout in EPUB. You can do this way in the SVG version, or you can do this way with CSS absolute positioning. And I shouldn't say by preference because the EPUB specs don't play any favorites here. You know, they don't say which is better. But a lot of people are using this style when they don't have PDF as a starting point, or even when they have PDF as a starting point. Although mapping the PDF imaging model, the PostScript imaging model, the SVG imaging model up to CSS is a very ugly, ugly task. So, and typically involves some bitmap rasterization because you can't do everything. So, but that's the reality. But in the near future, with the CSS page templates that I mentioned, it'll be easier. You'll be able to do something a lot more interesting. This is roughly correct markup. In your CSS, you could define a couple of regions, or what we call partitions, that are going to take flowing content from the body, and they're going to be positioned appropriately, you know, like columns. But you could think of this as a more general version of columns. And in the CSS page templates proposal, this can be layered into a master page sequence, and there can be parameterization so that on a landscape device versus a portrait device, you'll have some different behaviors of these regions. But the basic thing is that the content in the body here, or this could be from a div or from some other part of the content, a story, is going to flow here till it fills, and then it's going to start flowing here. So this here allows you to have kind of the best of both worlds. You get that visual output, but you get a completely semantically clean paragraph that can be used and reused for other purposes, can be read out loud, etc. So from an accessibility story, this is not good. This is better. This is kind of what you want. And EPUB lets you do all. And this, with the asterisk that this is not a finalized spec yet. Okay, so going on to the comparison. This is, you might say, my opinionated version of where we stand, and I'm sure there are some things you guys may disagree with, but just roughly speaking, where we were circa 2007 was pretty simple. Fixed layout PDF, reflowable EPUB. Very simple story, right? But now we have, with EPUB 3, we have reflowable and fixed. We have 3D here, interactive here. I guess that's the other really big difference here, is that the EPUB has, in addition to reflowable, it has interactive, which I'll put that PDF only has partial. I think calling it partial may be giving over credit to the current state of interactivity in PDF, but you know, let's give partial credit where credit is due. But of course, the prepress ready, all the print features of PDF are a key differentiation from EPUB. So that's the current situation, but very, very soon, we're going to have a couple of very key things. The template-based page layout that I showed you an example of, that's something Adobe is calling liquid layout and has been publicly demoing and is announced will be in the next version of InDesign Creative Suite. We're not under liberty to discuss here when that will be coming out, but let's just say most people expect it to be reasonably soon, quite soon. So the template-based liquid layout is a really key thing. It's quite likely that very soon EPUB will have the multiple rendition support that it already has in there. In EPUB, you can have more than one version of a publication that's an equal citizen packaged together. PDF has an alternate renditions mechanism, but that's sort of almost like a second-class way. You can't really put two PDFs together and call them alternates. So I gave it a no there, but I guess that's debatable. But soon in EPUB, we're going to develop a rendition mapping model that allows the renditions selection and mapping to be better handled, so that we can really give us a full grade there. And then there's certainly a possibility of 3D, either through our extension mechanism or just simply because the browsers are all getting WebGL 3D APIs that are, again, going to be hardware optimized. So having hardware optimized 3D in WebKit means that for EPUB to get it, it's almost like we get it for free. Now to get that to the full engineering level 3D, there's certainly some more work to be done. So that's about the content type. How about sort of the attributes of the formats? I think a key differentiation thing here is that the EPUB is always been Unicode-centric, and that's really complete now where we normatively reference the Unicode specs. It's an XML-based format. It's got very robust accessibility support, and it's perceived as vendor neutral. I'll get to that in a second. But PDF still trumps on being an ISO standard and on having an archival subset defined. I think PDF-A is an important thing, and the fact that we have JavaScript in EPUB now with EPUB 3 means that the importance of an even more lockdown archival form is even higher, and that's something we haven't defined yet. So that's, again, my rough take on where things are. The only change coming here is that there is a commitment by the IDPF to work towards an ISO standardization. We have issues, the same issues that PDF had in the original days with PDF-A, which is PDF-A really normatively referenced some non-standards. It referenced some Adobe stuff. It wasn't what somebody called a pure ISO standard. Our standard probably won't be pure ISO standard either because it's referencing some W3C stuff that's not finished yet. And in the case of HTML5 and some of the CSS3 modules, won't be finished for years and years to come. So we're wrestling through that, but let's just say we have 5 or 6 different ISO committees eager to help us standardize this. And we're also looking to standardize an archival profile. You might say an EPUB-A, so to speak. And that's important for some governments and others that want to use EPUB for some reports. So, the vendor thing. These are 2 screenshots, zoomed up a bit, from 2 of the presentations yesterday morning. And if you notice these little R's here, I think that this was these are sort of illegal, or at least they show the reality behind, or the perception behind the reality. I don't know which it is. You can say, hey, we got ISO 32000 and it's a neutral thing, and we can say we got PDF VT and it's a neutral thing developed by a committee. But when the logo is tied to this statement, note the bold. And this is from Adobe's website right now. I mean, this is saying.
The fact is what yeah.
No, I'm not expressing opinion. This is fact.
No, it's not.
What do you mean it's not? These were from yesterday's presentations, and this is from Adobe's website.
But
that's all I'm saying.
Those icons came out of Adobe presentations, and that logo. Well, actually, the only part of that logo, which is copyright Adobe, which is exactly what that language says, is the trefoils, that 3-pointed thing, which is actually where the R is. So if
does the ISO 32000 have it? Let me ask a question, please.
There is no official icon for 32000.
Okay. So what do people use? This one.
No, that's what Adobe employees use because we are legally permitted to do so. But actually, if you looked at other people's presentations, you would see that all of the non-Adobe presentations have other icons for representing PDF.
All right, so I withdraw my statement that it was illegal. But I would say this kind of thing creates the perception that PDF is still under Adobe's control. And in fact, to a large extent, if you look at all the things coming in, a large number of those things originate with Adobe. So it's not, I'm not debating whether that's good or bad, it's just what it is. And what that means is that regardless of whether you create a standard out of a spec developed by a single vendor, and this applies to Microsoft as well, right? I mean, Microsoft has notoriously developed specs that I think Adobe's done a far better job of being inclusive about the development of than Microsoft. But has made them ISO standards. And so there is an asterisk on the PDF ecosystem relative to this that I stand by this, which is EPUB is perceived accurately as having been developed in an open collaborative process, and PDF is perceived with whatever degree of accuracy as not. And that's all I'm saying, and I don't think that's argumentative. I think that's just the reality of the perception. So to wrap up, HTML5 is a cluster of technologies. It's not a markup language. And it includes SVG, which is the XML version of the PostScript PDF imaging model. And that is fundamentally a very critical fact in this situation. EPUB is just portable documents for the HTML5 of the browser stack. That's all you really need to remember about EPUB, because there's nothing fancy about it. But it does give you the end screen support, rich media and interactivity, accessibility, and a simple XML-friendly format. Now supporting both fixed and reflowable content, developed in an open, vendor-independent process. And HTML5 and EPUB are on a vector of very rapid improvement, powered by a huge developer ecosystem, open source, and the new market opportunities that it presents. So that's the end of my presentation today. I hope you guys we have about 12 minutes for questions, if you have them, 11 minutes, and then we'll move on. Thank you very much. Yes.
Good morning. I have one question. We are quite often involved in right management projects, and with PDF you have the advantage, for example, to make annotations, to fill out forms, and is there something in EPUB which is similar?
For forms, of course HTML5 has rich forms capabilities. And in fact, I think even now some of Adobe's forms solutions are using HTML, are creating HTML forms. So because EPUB 3 normatively references HTML5, we get all the forms features and the JavaScript validation and all that stuff. Now, in the past with EPUB 2, JavaScript wasn't even part of EPUB 2, and so there was really no forms capability in EPUB 2, and the market during this year is transitioning between EPUB 2 and EPUB 3. I believe the only reading system for EPUB that you can use forms with now commercially is Apple iBooks. But you can use forms and JavaScript with certain limitations, like they disable remote data access from JavaScript. But you can definitely use forms there, and that's one reason people are using the fixed layout EPUB, is that you can put forms in there. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, but the iBooks implementation doesn't do submit. So you can actually do fill, but there's no way to save it, there's no way to print it.
Because there's no remote data access, correct.
Right.
And that's something that we expect.
It's cute.
But it's not EPUB 3. So we anticipate, as people support EPUB 3, that they'll support the full spec. Apple was extending EPUB 2, and it was up to their discretion what to take and not take. And remote data access, let's say, there's sort of a tug of war in commercial publishing of how much the publisher gets to own of the user experience and how much the reading system gets to own. And remote data access is like the front line of the trenches right now. But I expect that the browser stack will prevail, and that remote data access will be de rigueur in EPUB reading systems. And in the Readium prototype that I showed you, that open source project that so many vendors like Apple, not Apple, but Google and Barnes & Noble and Kobo are helping with, that has full remote data access. The submit button works. So I think we're going to have a higher bar to hope Apple and others jump over. So
sorry, I continue a little bit from that. So I understand, as our customers publish training material. Training material, you make tests, so it's
sure.
To enter tests, your results get represented. So it's correct that you can fill out, but you cannot save and print.
No, I'm talking about the EPUB 3 specs. You're talking about implementations. But for example, we have Kaplan Learning is one of the largest publishers of educational material and educational testing in the United States. They're a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and they're investing heavily in EPUB 3-based learning materials, where obviously they're going to need remote data entry. And in fact, you're also going to see soon IMS Global is a standards organization that develops some of the standards in the e-learning learning management system integration space. And we're working with IMS Global and a third party that I can't disclose yet, who's also very active in digital publishing, around an end-to-end demonstration showing integrating the LMS e-learning assessment schemas with EPUB so that you can have a digital textbook with an end-of-chapter assessment that goes straight into the student's database, and then vice versa, and sort of end-to-end synchronization. So that's definitely something enabled by EPUB 3. But right now the market is put another way. This is like talking about the next version of Acrobat when everyone's still using the old version of Reader. That's almost the state we're in now during this transition between EPUB 2 and EPUB 3, which is a huge leap forward. So, other questions? Yes.
the tables that you were showing had the last column saying EPUB soon. Is there a timeline behind the soon in EPUB soon?
Well, we're developing, yeah, that's a great question. So we've decided to develop, not in a monolithic manner, but in a modular manner, similar to how the CSS working group is now developing CSS modules and doesn't intend to do a CSS3 per se in the foreseeable future, and similar to how many of the APIs in the JavaScript world are being developed. You know, the geolocation API isn't waiting for HTML6, and similar to Java JSRs. But we're just beginning that process, and we have now 4 different activities, one of which has already finished. So one way I'll say it is, one of the activities, the fixed layout metadata, only started a few months ago and is already done. So we are measuring ourselves in terms of months, not years, partly because we're not a de jure standards organization. We have a nimbler process than, say, the W3C even, where we can move pretty rapidly to go from spec, from proposal to spec. Liquid layout, CSS page templates, is on a path to mature very, very quickly as a final spec, or initial spec anyway, partly because we expect a major vendor to ship authoring tool software compatible with it very, very soon. So it'll be in our interest to get that standard done. So, yes?
How do validation of the EPUB? Do you use SVG, XML schema or something like that?
Yeah, RelaxNG is the normative schema used in the specs. But as far as the implementation, it's an open source Java thing. So if you go to the validator.idpf.org URL, there's a link to the open source, and you can go look how it's implemented. But the schema, the normative schemas are RelaxNG. But I don't know how it's implemented.
And you publish these schemas?
Yes, they're as I said, they're normatively part of our specs.
Okay.
Yeah.
The liquid layouts you demonstrated, are they specifically EPUB, or are they sort of going to be run with the CSS3 page modules?
The liquid layout, I didn't demonstrate it, but I mean the what I showed about the how you would encode that quick brown fox thing.
On the page.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that going to be a CSS3 module?
Well, we are working together with the W3C on alignment, and this is an area. There are certain areas where it's clear like the W3C should do something. So, for example, for vertical writing, that's part of something called CSS3 text module, and there's also something called CSS Ruby module for the phonetic annotation of Japanese and Chinese characters. Those modules are CSS modules that have been languishing. When we started doing EPUB 3, we breathed new life into that work and got a whole collection of folks in Asia working on them from Japan and Taiwan and other places. And ultimately, that has led to those standards moving faster in the W3C track through the IDPF work. But we didn't fork or clone them. We just pushed them forward and worked together with our liaison with W3C to do that. In other cases, it's very clear that W3C has no interest in doing something. The media overlays, the synchronizing pre-recorded audio with text, so you can have an audio book synced to the text, just wasn't on their radar screen, and so it's clear we should do that. This whole CSS regions and pagination, it's an area of active debate within the W3C CSS working group, how much they should bite off versus how much the IDPF should do. And Adobe actually took a piece of what was the original proposal for the CSS page templates that became the basis of 2 specs called CSS regions and CSS exclusions that have been moving forward on a CSS working group track. However, they have now become mired in controversy within the W3C CSS working group, and they are not stabilized, let's put it that way. And as a result, this CSS page templates thing no longer has a normative dependency on the CSS region spec, and we may have to redo it after the W3C gets done, or the W3C may take over our work, and that would actually be great. So if we can get the W3C to really take on pagination, great, but it's not clear that the CSS working group, what the will of that group is. So we bow and defer to them in every respect except time to market for the needs of our ecosystem, where we need to move fast at times, but we're committed to not forking the open web, but to making EPUB, the digital publishing for the open web, which means wherever possible it should be a CSS W3C thing. So that someday EPUB could go away like the communist state, wither away. So, all right, I think I have time for one last question, if there's one. I have 1 minute. Go ahead. I'm kidding.
So arbitrary inputs, okay, arbitrary content. EPUB originated for all kinds of very good reasons to make a lot of sense to me. It's originally about producing a document, much as many PDFs obviously are a function of outputting from InDesign, Quark, or whatever, going through PostScript, cranking out a document which you then distribute. And that's one of many the models under which PDF serves. Then there's arbitrary
content or arbitrary document world, where office documents or stuff in particular, let's say, it originates from a scanner. So what I'm not doubting that one could take a whole bunch of, let's say, scan pages and squeeze them into an EPUB, put an EPUB wrapper around it and serve it up. I'm wondering whether or not would anything be what would you say to the question of the world of stuff that isn't published documents but is instead avowedly arbitrary in terms of where it comes from?
Well, if you're talking about digitization from paper, then I think the only question there is how far up the stack of representation you want to go, right? If you have bitmap images of pages and that's it, whether you wrap it in a PDF wrapper or wrap it in an EPUB wrapper, it's the same stuff. Mm-hmm. It's a sequence of bitmap images. Yep. So you could use EPUB for that, you could use PDF for that. I think your choice would depend on where you want to take the content. If you want to sell it on a place that accepts EPUB, you should do EPUB. You know, if you want to send it to someone who expects PDF, you should do PDF. If you want to OCR it and take it up the levels of representation, there may come a point where you turn it into sort of SVG or PDF page contents like stuff. And again, your choice of representation would depend on use case. Yep. If you want to take it a level further up and extract the paragraphs and make it structured content, then I would argue that EPUB has a first-class way to represent that structured content and PDF doesn't, because it's designed to represent pages. It's designed to represent that laid out on a glyphs spray painted on a canvas level of representation, not paragraphs and so forth. The structure is sort of stitched on top of that spray paint. So I think if you want to take it all the way back to structure, then EPUB becomes a logical thing. But otherwise, I think it's just a question of where you want it to go. And certainly at the moment, there's a lot more places to take a PDF than there are to take an EPUB. So I would say in most cases, PDF still trumps as a broadly accepted portable document format, right? That's today. Factual. Yeah, exactly.
We're not talking about today.
Today we're talking about, this morning we're talking about today. Now, at the end of at the end tonight, we can talk about tomorrow.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you guys very much.